"You were always just window dressing, Mom. Now find your own way." Those were the exact words my daughter Stephanie said to me while standing in the marble foyer of the home I'd lived in for 28 years. She said it with such cold certainty, like she was dismissing a housekeeper who'd outlived her usefulness. My legs nearly gave out from under me, and I had to grab onto the banister of the spiral staircase Charles had built for me back in 1995. Window dressing. After 45 years of marriage, after raising her, after supporting Charles through every business deal and social obligation that built our family's fortune, my own daughter called me window dressing. The worst part? She said it with a smile. "I'm Ruth Ann Coleman. I'm 69 years old, and I'm here in my beautiful kitchen in Highland Park, Dallas. Yes, my kitchen, in my house, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I got it all back." What happened after Stephanie threw me out of my own home will shock you, and if you're dealing with greedy family members who think you're disposable, this story might just save your life. Now, before I continue, I need you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while listening to my story. Are you folding laundry, having your afternoon tea, or maybe just taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button, because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to hear this message. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because no woman should ever have to face family betrayal alone. Right now, I'm sitting at my granite kitchen island, looking out at the rose garden Charles planted for our 25th anniversary. The Texas sun is streaming through my bay windows. My coffee is perfectly brewed in my favorite china cup, and I'm wearing the diamond earrings Charles gave me for our last anniversary. But just 10 months ago, I was crying myself to sleep in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, wondering how my only child could throw me away like yesterday's newspaper. Charles had been dead for exactly 5 days when Stephanie walked into our living room, with her husband Kevin and a briefcase full of papers. She looked around at the oil paintings, the antique furniture, the Persian rugs we'd collected over decades of marriage, and said those horrible words about window dressing. Then she handed me a check for $10,000 and told me I had 48 hours to pack my personal belongings and leave. She said Charles had left her everything: the house, Coleman Oil Company, the investments, the life insurance, everything. She said I was lucky to get the $10,000, that most widows my age would be grateful for such generosity. I believed her, because why would your own daughter lie about something like that? Why would the child you raised, educated, and loved unconditionally look you in the eye and destroy your entire world with lies? But Charles always used to say, "Ruth, sometimes the people who smile the brightest are hiding the darkest secrets." I wish I'd understood what he was trying to tell me. What I discovered 6 days later didn't just change my life. It exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been stealing millions from hundreds of elderly women just like me. And when I tell you what was really in Charles's will, you'll understand why Stephanie went from laughing at me to begging me not to destroy her life. Let me take you back to 1978, when I was 24 years old and Dallas was booming with oil money and big dreams. I was working as a secretary at First National Bank, making about $12,000 a year, when Charles Coleman walked into the loan department wearing a perfectly pressed suit and carrying blueprints for an oil drilling venture. He was 31, confident, and had the kind of Texas charm that made everyone in the room pay attention when he spoke. Back then, gas was 63 cents a gallon, a house in Highland Park cost $40,000, and Charles was already making smart moves in the oil business. Texas was riding high on the energy boom. Everyone wanted a piece of the black gold underneath our feet. Charles had inherited a small drilling operation from his father, but he had bigger visions. He wanted to build Coleman Oil into something that would last for generations. We got married in 1979, right when everyone was talking about that energy crisis and long gas lines. Our wedding was at Highland Park Methodist Church, and Charles said our first dance song, "The Way You Look Tonight," was perfect because I'd always be the most beautiful woman in any room. We honeymooned in Hawaii, and I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. Stephanie came along in 1981, the same year MTV launched, and everyone thought music videos were going to change the world. Charles was over the moon about having a daughter. He'd hold her for hours, talking to her about the oil business like she was going to be his business partner someday. "Ruth," he'd say, "this little girl is going to be something special. She's got the Coleman drive and your sweet spirit." If only we'd known how wrong he was about that sweet spirit. Charles built Coleman Oil through the 1980s and 1990s, riding the waves of the energy market like a master surfer. Those were golden years in Texas. The economy was strong, real estate was booming, and oil money was flowing like water. By the time Stephanie graduated from SMU in 2003 with her business degree, we were living in our current mansion in Highland Park, a 6,000-square-foot dream home with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a circular driveway lined with magnolia trees. I was the perfect oil executive's wife, just like my mother taught me to be. I hosted dinner parties for Charles's business partners, organized charity galas for the Junior League, supported the Dallas Symphony, and never questioned when Charles said I didn't need to worry about business matters. "Oil's a man's world, sweetheart," he'd say with a kiss on my forehead. "You just keep being the gracious, beautiful hostess you are." Stephanie was our pride and joy, or so I thought. She was smart, graduated summa cum laude, and seemed destined for great things. Charles was thrilled when she married Kevin Walsh in 2007, a handsome young man who worked in commercial real estate. They looked like the perfect power couple, and Charles immediately brought Kevin into Coleman Oil as a junior executive. But looking back now, I can see the warning signs I missed. Stephanie always had a calculating side, even as a child. When she was 8, I caught her going through my jewelry box. And when I asked what she was doing, she said, "Just checking what's going to be mine someday." When she was 16 and wanted a Mercedes for her birthday, she played Charles and me against each other until she got exactly what she wanted. Charles's business kept expanding through the 2010s. Coleman Oil wasn't just drilling anymore. We were investing in pipeline projects, renewable energy ventures, and real estate developments. Charles was working longer hours, taking more meetings, traveling to Houston and Oklahoma City regularly. When I'd ask about the business, he'd just say, "Everything's better than good, Ruth. We're building something that'll take care of Stephanie's children and their children." By 2020, Charles was talking about having $28 million in total assets. $28 million. It was more money than I could even comprehend. He'd joke that Stephanie and Kevin would never have to worry about money, that the Coleman name would mean something in Texas for generations to come. But Charles started acting strange in his final years. He'd get mysterious phone calls and step into his study to take them privately. He installed a new safe in his office and changed the locks. Sometimes I'd find him staring out the window with this worried expression, like he was carrying some terrible burden. The last conversation I had with Charles was on March 8, 2023, the night before his stroke. We were getting ready for bed, and he turned to me with the most serious look I'd ever seen on his face. "Ruth, if something happens to me, promise me you'll call Walter Hutchins at the law firm before you do anything else. Promise me you won't make any decisions until you talk to Walter." I promised, but I thought he was just being overly cautious. Charles had always been a planner. Charles's stroke happened without any warning on March 9, 2023. He was in his study, reviewing some contracts with Kevin, when Kevin heard a crash and found Charles collapsed on the floor. The paramedics said it was massive. Charles was gone before the ambulance even reached Presbyterian Hospital. The funeral was everything Charles would have wanted. Half of Highland Park showed up to pay their respects, along with oil executives, city council members, and business partners from across Texas. The church was packed, and the flower arrangements alone probably cost more than most people make in a year. Stephanie and Kevin handled all the arrangements, which I appreciated because I could barely function through my grief. But even at the funeral, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. Stephanie was dry-eyed during the entire service, more focused on networking with the business associates than mourning her father. Kevin kept checking his phone and whispering with men I didn't recognize. Serious-looking guys in expensive suits who definitely weren't from our usual social circle. When I asked Stephanie who these men were, She brushed me off. Just some of Dad's business contacts, Mom. Nothing for you to worry about. The day after we buried Charles, Stephanie showed up at the house with Kevin and a leather portfolio. She found me in the kitchen, still in my robe, trying to force down a piece of toast for the first time in 3 days. Mom, we need to discuss Dad's estate, she announced, pulling out a chair across from me like she was conducting a business meeting. I know this is difficult, but there are legal matters that can't wait. She opened the portfolio and spread out several official-looking documents. According to Stephanie, Charles had restructured his will 6 months before his death, naming her as the primary beneficiary of Coleman Oil, the house, and all financial assets. She explained it like she was reading from a script. Dad felt that since you'd never been involved in business decisions, it would be irresponsible to burden you with managing $28 million in assets, she said with fake sympathy. He wanted to make sure everything stayed in capable hands. My heart started racing. But what about me? This is my home, Stephanie. Your father and I built this life together. Kevin leaned forward with this patronizing smile. Ruth, Charles set up a trust fund that will cover your basic living expenses. But honestly, this house is way too much for you to handle alone. The property taxes alone are $36,000 a year. We found you a lovely apartment in a senior community, Stephanie added. Much more appropriate for someone your age. You'll have activities, people to socialize with, no maintenance worries. I felt like I couldn't breathe. You want me to move to a retirement home? I'm 69 years old, not 90. That's when Stephanie's mask started to slip. Mom, you need to be realistic about your situation. You've never worked a real job, you have no business experience, and frankly, you'd just be in the way if you tried to get involved in Dad's companies. Over the next few days, Stephanie became increasingly aggressive. She started showing up with real estate appraisers to assess the property value. She had Charles's study cleared out without asking if I wanted to keep any of his personal items. She even had new business cards printed for Coleman Oil with her name as CEO. When I tried to call Walter Hutchins, Charles's longtime attorney and the man he'd specifically told me to contact, Stephanie intercepted my call. Mom, Walter's no longer handling our family's legal affairs, she said coolly. We've moved everything to a firm that specializes in complex estate planning. You don't need to worry about those details. That should have been my first major red flag, but I was so overwhelmed with grief and shock that I didn't think clearly. Stephanie kept pushing the narrative that I was incapable of handling complicated business matters, and that Charles had specifically wanted her to protect me from the stress of managing wealth. The breaking point came on March 14th, exactly 5 days after Charles's funeral. Stephanie and Kevin arrived at 8 a.m. with a moving truck and 3 workers. Stephanie walked into the kitchen where I was having my morning coffee, the same kitchen where Charles had kissed me goodbye for the last time just 6 days earlier. Mom, we need to expedite this transition, she announced. The movers are here to pack your personal belongings. Your new apartment is ready, and the first year's rent is already paid. I stood up so fast that my coffee cup shattered on the marble floor. Stephanie Marie Coleman Walsh, your father just died 5 days ago. I haven't even begun to process losing him, and you're throwing me out of our home? That's when she said those words that will haunt me forever. You were always just window dressing, Mom. Now find your own way. The movers started loading my belongings while I stood there in shock. Kevin handed me that check for $10,000 and said, "This should cover your immediate expenses until the trust fund payments start." As they packed 45 years of my life into cardboard boxes, Stephanie walked through the house like she already owned it, pointing out which furniture she was keeping and which pieces were going to charity. My grandmother's china cabinet, gone to Goodwill. Charles's favorite recliner where he'd read the newspaper every morning, donated. The photo albums documenting our entire marriage, packed away in storage I couldn't afford to maintain. I spent that first night in a sterile 1-bedroom apartment in a complex called Golden Years Manor, surrounded by boxes and crying until I had no tears left. But I remembered Charles's words about calling Walter Hutchins, and 6 days later, That phone call changed everything. I woke up on March 15th in that tiny apartment, feeling like I'd aged 20 years overnight. The walls were thin, and I could hear the neighbor's television through the wall. Back in our house, Stephanie's house, I kept reminding myself, Charles and I used to wake up to the sound of mockingbirds singing in our oak trees. Here, all I could hear was traffic from the nearby freeway. I made coffee using paper cups because my china was somewhere in a storage unit I couldn't afford. That's when I remembered Charles's last words. "Promise me you'll call Walter Hutchins before you do anything else." Walter Hutchins had been Charles's attorney for over 20 years. I'd known Walter since the 1980s. He'd handled our house purchase, business contracts, and estate planning. But Stephanie had told me he was no longer involved with our family's legal affairs. Something about that didn't sit right with me. Charles trusted Walter completely. Why would he tell me to call Walter if he'd switched attorneys? I dialed Hutchins and Associates at exactly 9 a.m. When I asked to speak with Walter, the receptionist immediately put me through. "Ruth, my God, I've been trying to reach you for a week." Walter's familiar voice sounded genuinely distressed. "Stephanie told me you were too distraught to handle any legal discussions and that all communication should go through her. But I really need to speak with you directly." My heart started pounding. "Walter, I need to understand what Charles really left me. Stephanie says there's just a small trust fund, but I need to see the actual will." There was a long pause. Then Walter said something that made my world stop spinning. "Ruth, honey, what exactly has Stephanie told you about Charles's will?" I explained everything. How Stephanie claimed to inherit the business and house, how I was supposedly just getting a trust fund, how I'd been moved to a senior apartment because I was incapable of handling complex financial matters. Another pause. Then Walter's voice got very serious. "Ruth, I need you to come to my office immediately. And whatever you do, don't discuss this conversation with Stephanie or Kevin." An hour later, I was sitting in Walter's familiar office, watching him pull out Charles's real will with hands that were shaking almost as badly as mine. "Ruth," Walter said gently, "Charles never changed his will. You are the sole beneficiary of everything, the house, the business, all bank accounts, investments, and life insurance. $28 million. The room started spinning. But Stephanie showed me documents. "Whatever Stephanie showed you was fabricated. This is Charles's actual will, filed with the probate court the day after his death." Walter's face was grim. "Ruth, your daughter may have committed serious fraud." But then Walter dropped an even bigger bombshell. "There's something else, Ruth. Charles came to see me 6 months before he died, and he was very concerned about some things he'd discovered about Stephanie and Kevin's business activities." Walter pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. Charles had been investigating some suspicious real estate transactions that Stephanie and Kevin were involved in. He hired a private investigator, and what they found was disturbing. My head was spinning. What kind of transactions? Ruth, Stephanie, and Kevin have been running a real estate scam targeting elderly widows throughout North Texas. They identify women who've recently lost their husbands, approach them during their grief when they're most vulnerable, and convince them to sell their homes for far below market value. I felt like I was going to be sick. "What do you mean?" Walter opened the folder and showed me dozens of documents. They tell these widows that the housing market is about to crash, that their homes need expensive repairs they can't afford, that they'd be better off in senior communities. They pressure them to sell quickly, often for 30 to 50% below market value. Then Stephanie and Kevin flip the properties for huge profits. The pages blurred as tears filled my eyes. How many women? Charles's investigator documented at least 200 victims over the past 3 years. Ruth, they've stolen over $12 million from vulnerable seniors. I couldn't speak. My own daughter was preying on grieving widows just like me. "There's more," Walter continued. "Charles discovered that Stephanie was planning to do the same thing to you after his death. The fake will, the pressure to move to a senior community, the claim that you couldn't handle your finances. It's exactly the same pattern she used on all the other victims. Walter pulled out a handwritten letter. Charles wrote this for you before he died, Ruth. He wanted you to have it if something happened to him. With trembling hands, I read Charles's final message to me. My dearest Ruth, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've discovered what Stephanie has become. I never wanted to burden you with the knowledge that our daughter is a criminal, but I couldn't let her destroy your future like she's destroyed so many other families. I've documented everything and left the evidence with Walter. The FBI has been contacted and they're building a case. Everything I've done was to protect you and bring justice to the women Stephanie has victimized. You are stronger than you know, my darling. Fight back. All my love always, Charles. If you're feeling the shock and betrayal that I felt in that moment, show your support. Hit that like button. Comment if you've ever discovered that family members were lying to you about something this devastating. And subscribe because we strong women need to stick together when we uncover the darkest truths. Walter, I said, my voice getting stronger with every word. What do we do now? Walter Hutchins smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Now, Ruth, we take back everything that's rightfully yours, and we make sure Stephanie pays for what she's done to you and all those other women. The war was just beginning, but for the first time since Charles died, I felt like I had an army on my side. Walking out of Walter's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, pure, burning determination. Not the helpless anger I'd felt as a widow being manipulated, but the kind of focused fury that comes when you realize you've been systematically betrayed by someone you'd have died to protect. My first stop was Wells Fargo, where Walter had arranged for me to access the accounts that were rightfully mine. When the bank manager, Mrs. Peterson, pulled up my account information, her eyes went wide. Mrs. Coleman, there seems to be some confusion. Someone has been attempting to transfer funds from these accounts, but the transactions were blocked due to probate holds that your attorney, Mr. Hutchins, put in place. Stephanie had been trying to steal my money before Charles was even cold in the ground. Mrs. Peterson, I need complete records of every attempted transaction since March 9th, I said, my voice steady and businesslike. And I want security footage of anyone who came into this bank claiming to represent my interests. While we waited for the records, I called the FBI field office in Dallas. Walter had given me the contact information for Agent Maria Santos, who was already familiar with Charles's evidence about Stephanie's real estate fraud. Mrs. Coleman, we've been hoping to speak with you, Agent Santos said when I identified myself. Your husband provided us with substantial evidence of your daughter's criminal activities. We need your cooperation to build a case that will protect the victims and recover their stolen money. Agent Santos, I'll do whatever it takes to stop Stephanie from hurting anyone else. Good. We're going to need you to act normally around Stephanie while we prepare to make arrests. Can you handle that? I thought about all those vulnerable widows who'd been tricked by my daughter. I thought about Stephanie calling me window dressing. Agent Santos, I can handle anything you need me to do. Excellent. We'll be moving quickly. The arrests will happen within 72 hours, but first, we need to get you back into your home with witnesses present. That's when Agent Santos smiled. How would you feel about surprising your daughter with an unexpected visit? The next morning, I put on my best dress, a navy blue Oscar de la Renta that Charles had bought me for our 40th anniversary, and drove to Highland Park. My hands were shaking as I pulled into the circular driveway, but they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from anticipation. I rang my own doorbell. When Stephanie opened the door, the look of shock on her face was priceless. Mom, what are you doing here? Hello, sweetheart. I need to collect a few more of your father's personal items, some insurance documents that might be important. My voice was calm, almost sweet. Stephanie's eyes narrowed. Mom, we've been through this. All of Dad's papers are being handled by professionals now. You don't need to worry about any of that. Oh, but I do need to worry, Stephanie. You see, I've been talking to some very interesting people about your father's estate. I walked past her into the foyer with Walter Hutchins and Agent Santos following behind me. Stephanie's face went white when she saw them. "What's going on here?" Kevin appeared from the living room, looking panicked. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," Agent Santos said, pulling out her badge. "FBI, we need to speak with both of you about some real estate transactions you've been involved in." The next few minutes were like watching dominoes fall. Kevin immediately started stuttering excuses, while Stephanie tried to maintain her composure but kept shooting desperate looks toward the door. "There must be some mistake," Stephanie said, her voice getting higher. "We're legitimate real estate investors. We help elderly people make smart financial decisions. Like you helped Mrs. Eleanor Patterson sell her Highland Park home for $200,000 when it was worth $450,000? Agent Santos asked, reading from her notes. Stephanie's face crumbled. "Or like you helped Mrs. Virginia Martinez sell her Plano house for $160,000 when it was worth $320,000. Kevin made a break for the back door, but 2 more FBI agents were waiting in the backyard. They brought him back in handcuffs. "Stephanie Walsh and Kevin Walsh, you're under arrest for real estate fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy," Agent Santos announced, reading them their Miranda rights. As the agents led Kevin away, Stephanie turned to me with pure desperation in her eyes. "Mom, you can't let them do this. I'm your daughter." "You stopped being my daughter the moment you called me window dressing and threw me out of my own home," I said calmly. "But more importantly, you stopped being my daughter when you started stealing from grieving widows." Walter handed me the keys to my house. "Welcome home, Ruth." For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of anyone or anything. I was Ruth Ann Coleman, widow, survivor, and CEO of Coleman Oil. Nobody was ever going to underestimate me again. As I watched the FBI car drive away with my daughter in the back seat, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The sweet satisfaction of justice served. The next few weeks were like watching a house of cards collapse in the most satisfying way possible. Stephanie, who just days earlier had been treating me like a discarded piece of furniture, was now calling me from jail, sobbing and begging for help. "Mom, please, you have to help me," she cried during her first phone call from the Dallas County Jail. "This is all a misunderstanding. I never meant to hurt anyone. You have to believe me." "Stephanie," I said calmly, "I seem to remember you telling me I was just window dressing. Perhaps you should find your own way, just like you told me to do." The FBI's investigation moved like lightning once they had Charles's evidence and my cooperation. Agent Santos showed me the full scope of Stephanie and Kevin's operation, and it was even worse than I'd imagined. They hadn't just been stealing from individual widows. They'd created an entire network of fake real estate companies, phony appraisers, and corrupt contractors who would give artificially low estimates to scare elderly women into panic selling. Within 48 hours of the arrests, the FBI had seized over $8 million in assets from various accounts that Stephanie and Kevin had used to hide their profits. The Dallas Morning News picked up the story, and suddenly our family's private nightmare was front-page news. Highland Park couple accused of defrauding elderly widows out of millions. The media attention brought forward even more victims. Women started calling the FBI tip line, sharing stories of how Stephanie and Kevin had approached them during their most vulnerable moments. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an 82-year-old widow from Plano, told reporters how Stephanie had convinced her to sell her home of 30 years for half its value by claiming the roof was about to collapse. "She seemed so nice, so concerned about my welfare," Mrs. Chen said through tears. "She said I reminded her of her own mother and that she couldn't bear to see me get stuck with expensive repairs I couldn't afford." That interview broke my heart. Stephanie had used me, had used the idea of caring for an elderly mother as part of her manipulation tactics. Kevin, meanwhile, discovered what it felt like to have no power at all. The real estate empire he'd built on stolen money crumbled overnight when banks froze all their accounts. The BMW he drove was repossessed. The Highland Park condo they'd been renting was foreclosed on when they couldn't make payments. On the third day after the arrests, Kevin's lawyer called Walter Hutchins with a plea deal offer. Kevin was willing to testify against Stephanie in exchange for a reduced sentence, claiming that the entire fraud scheme had been her idea. Apparently, honor among thieves is a myth, Walter told me with a dry smile. But the most satisfying moment came when Stephanie's bail was set. The judge, after hearing testimony about the scope of the fraud and the number of elderly victims, set bail at $2 million. Stephanie called me that evening, desperate. "Mom, I need you to post bail for me. I can't stay in here with these people. Please, I'll do anything." "Stephanie," I said quietly, "do you remember Mrs. Patterson? The 85-year-old woman whose house you stole for $200,000 when it was worth nearly $500,000? Silence. "She's living in a studio apartment now because she can't afford anything better. She eats one meal a day to make her Social Security check stretch. Do you remember Mrs. Martinez? She lost her family home of 40 years because you convinced her she couldn't afford to keep it." More silence. "Those women trusted you because you reminded them of their own daughters. You used their grief, their loneliness, their fear of being homeless, and you turned it into profit margins." "But Mom, I never meant—" "You meant every bit of it, Stephanie. And now you get to experience what it feels like to be powerless and scared and abandoned by the people who should love you most." I hung up the phone and slept better that night than I had in years. The Dallas District Attorney's Office moved aggressively on the case. Within 2 weeks, they'd filed charges against 12 other people who were part of Stephanie and Kevin's network. Fake appraisers, corrupt contractors, and even a few other real estate agents who'd been recruiting vulnerable widows. The most shocking discovery came when investigators found Stephanie's target lists. Actual spreadsheets where she'd tracked recently widowed women, their estimated home values, and notes about their psychological vulnerabilities. I was on that list, marked as priority target, high-value asset, recent loss, isolated. My own daughter had literally put me on a list of people to victimize. But the investigation also revealed something beautiful. Charles had been secretly helping some of the fraud victims before his death. He'd been anonymously paying property taxes for 3 elderly women who'd lost their homes, and he'd funded home repairs for 2 others who'd been scared into bad deals. Even in his final months while battling our daughter's evil, Charles had been trying to make things right. 8 months later, I was standing in the executive conference room of Coleman Oil, looking out at the Dallas skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view from the 42nd floor was breathtaking. You could see all the way to Fort Worth on a clear day. But the most beautiful sight wasn't the cityscape. It was the signed contract on the mahogany table behind me. Coleman Oil had just completed the largest acquisition in our company's history, purchasing 3 smaller energy companies that would double our production capacity and create over 200 new jobs. I'd negotiated the entire deal myself, with help from the management team that Charles had assembled over the decades. The woman standing in that boardroom wasn't the same person who'd been thrown out of her own home 10 months earlier. Ruth Ann Coleman, the window dressing who supposedly couldn't handle complex financial matters, was now the CEO of a $100 million company, and I was damn good at it. The first thing I'd done after reclaiming my life was meet with Tom Bradley, Coleman Oil's longtime operations manager. Tom had worked with Charles for 15 years and knew every aspect of the business. "Mrs. Coleman," Tom told me during our first meeting, "Charles used to say that you understood the business better than most of his executives because you actually listened during all those dinner party conversations. He said you had an intuitive grasp of market psychology." It turned out Charles had been right. I'd spent decades absorbing information about oil markets, energy policy, and business strategy through osmosis. When Tom and I started working together, I discovered I had strong instincts about investment opportunities and risk management. Within 6 months, we'd restructured Coleman Oil's debt, diversified into renewable energy projects, and increased our profit margins by 18%. The business media took notice. Forbes ran a profile titled "The Widow Who Became a CEO," and Texas Monthly put me on their cover as Executive of the Year. But the most meaningful part of my new life started with a phone call from Agent Santos. "Mrs. Coleman, we've recovered over $11 million from your daughter's fraud scheme, and the courts are ready to distribute restitution to the victims. We'd like you to consider heading up a victim assistance program." That call led to the creation of the Charles Coleman Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. Using part of Coleman Oil's profits and some of my personal inheritance, we established a comprehensive program that helps seniors who've been financially exploited by family members, caregivers, or scammers. Our first major initiative was called Second Chances, where we provide emergency housing assistance to elderly fraud victims who've lost their homes. We've helped over 150 seniors get back on their feet, including Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Martinez, who are now living in beautiful assisted living communities that we partially subsidize. The foundation also operates a legal aid clinic where volunteer attorneys help seniors recover stolen assets and protect themselves from future exploitation. We've recovered over $6 million for victims in our first year alone. But my proudest achievement is our education program. We send teams to senior centers, churches, and community groups throughout Texas to teach elderly people how to recognize and avoid financial scams. We call it Spotting the Vultures, a name that Charles would have loved. My personal life has transformed too. For 45 years, I'd been Charles's wife, and then Stephanie's mother. Now I'm just Ruth, and I've discovered that I actually like this person I'm getting to know. I joined the board of the Dallas Museum of Art, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt qualified for. I started taking cooking classes at the Culinary Institute, Italian cuisine, which Charles always said was too fancy for Texas tastes. I even started dating again, something I thought I'd never do. Nothing serious, just dinner companions who appreciate conversation with an intelligent, successful woman. The biggest surprise came when the governor of Texas appointed me to the State Banking Commission, a regulatory body that oversees financial institutions. My experience as both a fraud victim and a business executive made me uniquely qualified to spot the warning signs of financial abuse. As for Stephanie, she was ultimately convicted on 14 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to her victims. Kevin received 8 years and agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations into similar scams across the Southwest. Stephanie writes to me occasionally from prison, usually around holidays or her birthday. The letters always follow the same pattern: apologies, excuses, and eventual requests for money for her prison commissary account. I don't respond to them anymore. Some bridges burn completely when you betray the people who loved you most. But I do think about the family we could have been. Sometimes I wonder if Charles and I spoiled Stephanie too much, if we failed to teach her the difference between entitlement and earning respect. Then I remember all the vulnerable widows she preyed upon, and I realize that some people are just wired differently. You can't love someone into having a conscience. My evenings now are peaceful in a way they never were during my marriage. I read business journals and mystery novels, I tend to my rooftop garden at my downtown penthouse, and I video chat with the elderly women our foundation has helped rebuild their lives. I go to bed when I want, eat what I want for dinner, and wake up every morning grateful for the strength I discovered in my darkest hour. Charles's death taught me something precious. Sometimes the people who love us most prepare us for battles we don't even know we'll have to fight. Charles spent his final months gathering evidence to protect me and hundreds of other women from our daughter's cruelty. Now I spend my days making sure no vulnerable senior has to face financial predators alone. If I could go back and tell that broken woman crying in that terrible apartment 10 months ago what I know now, I'd say this: Ruth, stop letting them convince you that you're helpless. The worst betrayal of your life is about to become your greatest transformation. You see, I spent 69 years thinking I was weak because I'd never had to be strong. I thought I was incapable because Charles had always handled the big decisions. I thought I was worthless because my own daughter convinced me I was nothing but window dressing. But sometimes it takes losing everything to realize you were never as fragile as everyone pretended you were. The biggest lesson I've learned is that respect isn't something you can inherit or demand. It's something you earn through your actions. Stephanie thought she could steal my dignity along with my money, but dignity isn't something that can be taken from you. It's something you either choose to keep or choose to surrender. I want every woman listening to this story to understand something fundamental. It's never too late to discover your own power. I don't care if you're 55, 75, or 85 years old. You are not window dressing. You are not dead weight. You are not too old to fight back when someone tries to exploit your grief or your trust. If someone in your family is pressuring you to make financial decisions while you're grieving, if they're telling you that you're incapable of managing your own affairs, if they're trying to rush you into selling your home or signing over your assets, stop. Get a second opinion. Call a lawyer. Trust your instincts because they're probably right. And to the adult children who might be listening, the ones who see their elderly parents as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings deserving of love and respect, let me tell you something. The way you treat your parents when they're vulnerable says everything about your character. Stephanie thought she was clever, but criminals always underestimate their victims. The same disrespect you show your parents will come back to you tenfold. Charles used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when they think no one will ever find out. Stephanie failed that test spectacularly, but it gave me the chance to pass it myself. If this story of justice and transformation touched your heart, like this video right now, tell me in the comments what gave you strength when you felt powerless, and subscribe to Grandma's Legacy. Because every grandmother has wisdom worth hearing and strength worth celebrating. Remember, each like is so important to help these stories reach women who need to hear them. I'm Ruth Ann Coleman. I'm 70 years old now, and I'm here to tell you that being underestimated might just be the greatest advantage you'll ever have.